So I had a thought, and obviously this one kept me up, so here I am at 5 o'clock in the morning and trying to discuss it. And that thought centered around a conversation that I had with somebody I respect, remarkably on Twitter, actually. Um, Mainly because he has some pretty good character. I agree with him on most things. There's just one thing I don't agree with him on, and it's not necessarily a bad disagreement. Like, you do you, basically. I don't give a shit. I just don't see a point in it. And it got me thinking of how or why someone would be this way. Why they would think in these certain terms. And I wondered if it had something to do with social behaviors that span across generations. And there is a cross-generational gap. And this cross-generational gap tends to pick up things, and I guess you could say just dwell in the past. It's the kind of the mantra of never forget, but always forgive. Although not everybody forgives. So one thing you may notice for certain people is that they will bring stuff up from the past and try to beat you in the face with it, even though it happened, say, I don't know, 10 years ago. Your significant others may do this. My sister, my mother, and my sister-in-law all do this. Remarkably to my brothers and I, cluelessness, I guess you could say. This is a very bad trait for us in particular, is we don't know what the hell they're talking about. It happened so long ago, we don't care. We've moved on. Some people don't. I happen to point out the females in my family because those are the ones that do it the most. But I do have cousins and all that other stuff that do that too. And I noticed that other people do it as well. And I wondered why. Because I don't quite understand it. I don't live in that perception. So I don't understand why the things of the past would make any relevance to things of now. Or the future, for that matter. I don't give a shit about the future either. I do plan somewhat for it, mostly in the cases of when I die, but I don't plan for, like, next week for the most part, because shit usually just falls apart and I give up. But anyways, I digress. The point I'm trying to make is there is what they call a trans-generational, as fun as that sounds, or cross-generational behavior pattern. Basically what happens is the knowledge and wisdom, particularly wisdom, of your elders transmits down to the children and then grandchildren, depending on if the grandparents are still alive when the grandchildren are old enough to comprehend. But this knowledge will get transferred down in a very tribal nature. It's very distinctive to the human race. Mainly because we are, on average, live 40 to 80 years. A lot of us know our grandparents. Some of us were fortunate to know our great-grandparents in some cases. And what happens is the wisdom of our elders is transmitted to our children and our children's children. We've been doing this for thousands upon thousands of years, and it used to be a survival mechanism. But it's also tribal, and because it's tribal, it makes it, I don't know how to put it. It makes it very difficult to get over, I guess. So if you start creating groups based on your tribe, in a society as large as ours, where we are literally a global society on the brink of becoming one, probably corporate level first. Actually, that's already happened. Social levels are beginning to merge, but there's still a national pride that exists. And that national pride is what's going to prevent globalization for the most part. Understandably so, because culture is distinct to geography and not by race. Sadly, people haven't figured this out yet, but that's another video coming. This one in particular, I want to focus and talk about this cross-generational behavior. Mainly because I think you'll find it rather illuminating. So what happens? This is how it's transmitted. The experiences, the known experiences, the knowledge, the grouping, the outgrouping, the in-grouping is primarily based upon the behaviors and experiences of the most eldest person in the family. This would be the grandparents. So if my grandparents were in fact still alive, none of them are, they would be transmitting experiences that their parents had given to them and their grandparents. Now, we have to go to the level of probably grandparent and great-grandparent to make this apparent. That was a fun sentence. So at the great-grandparent level, that would be those that lived in the 1900s through, say, the World War I and II. To give an example, my great-grandfather was born in 1909. I actually got to know him up until I was 20 years old. So that experience is unique. It doesn't always happen, unless you're Mormon, apparently, or live in Utah, because they all get pregnant at like 20 years old. So the generational gap is 20 instead of some other places where it's like 30 or 40 now. At any rate, what happens is the experiences... Well, hello, cat. Apparently my cat wanted to say hello. Oh, and she's going to play pirate. All right. The generational experiences from your great-grandparents were those at the level of Jim Crow, extreme racism. The KKK existed at that point. There was a lot of shit going on, right? Up until the 60s. Now, they grew up, and they probably hit 30 or 40. For my great-grandparent in particular, he was having children during the time that segregation and Jim Crow and all that shit was going on, although it shouldn't have been going on, which is fucking retarded. But anyways, that stuff happened during my grandparents' era. So it's more than likely that my grandparents' level or age, they were extremely bigoted. In fact, I've heard stories, and this is true. At least it came from my mother. So I'm going to use my family as a demonstration of how this knowledge is transmitted. I can't call it knowledge. It's opinion. It's lived experience. It's not necessarily knowledge. Well, kind of is. It's explicit knowledge. Anyways, the lived experiences get transmitted across. And so my grandparents would then have experienced the segregation of our society up to and through their kids. To give a small story, there was I guess back in the 60s, which is fun, roller skating rinks were the thing in Utah. Like, 4 wheels on your feet, roller skating, that kind of thing. Not ice skating or blading or whatever the hell they do. I actually like the blades over the roller skate. Anyways, roller skating was the thing. They go to roller skating rinks. That's where everybody went. That's where the cool kids were at, right? So you'd go there, and my mom met this black kid that was there and thought he was the hottest shit, like super attractive. She was totally into him. Her grandparent, my grandparent, and her mother pulled her off the rink and said, "You ain't having none of that, around my family." She didn't understand it, personally. At least that's what she told me at the time. She later figured out that they were extremely bigoted and not cool. She was growing up in a time where segregation was now illegal, that racism was supposed to be something being fought against. This is just before, mind you, the civil rights and the march and I'd give you the clip of Martin Luther King, but apparently it's banned in 10 countries, because the last time I used it, that video got massively flagged and massively flagged and banned. It wasn't necessarily copyright claim. Well, actually, ABC tried to copyright claim it. I told them to fuck off. But it did get mass flagged by places like Turkey and Saudi Arabia. So if you want any clue of where bigotry still lives and whatnot, there's a correlation between religion and country. That's all I'm going to say. Anyways, so what happened then is she learned that her parents were bigoted And she was told that because this person was black, she wasn't allowed to like them. She didn't like it, obviously. She ended up marrying a white guy because, well, Utah's like 90% white. It's ridiculous. Yeah, long story. But anyways, so what happens from there? That's my parents at the age of like 10 or 12 or 15 or something like that. They have me at 78. 78 was the year that the Mormon Church decided black people and anybody that's not white, essentially, can now have the priesthood. And to them, the priesthood is a sacred thing. So when they were not allowing it, it's a segregated movement. And that segregation was because they believe God has cursed the skin of anybody that's not white, essentially. It's a very racist thing. If you don't believe me, go look it up in the Book of Mormon. It's a really exciting retardation. But essentially, they used to teach this as a religious practice, that those that are dark-skinned or even, not fair-skinned were cursed by God, essentially. That information indeed also transferred across. So one of the reasons I don't like Mormon culture is because it's extremely bigoted for this very reason. Again, I digress. I'm getting all over the place. Trying to keep my story straight here. So what happens then is now I'm into the picture in 78. I'm living in an era where segregation is illegal. There should be an integrated society. It's mostly forced at this point. Parents went through the civil rights aftermath, if you will. They were probably the hippie part of the movement itself. Give it the Bernie Sanders level of age around the 60s, where your parents were probably in the civil rights. They were active in the civil rights, fighting against their parents who were doing a great injustice. Now take the perception and flip it. The ones that were being persecuted were the grandparents at this point. They teach their kids, don't trust anybody that doesn't look like you. Why? Because at their time, that's exactly what was happening. Their family was being persecuted by people that look like me. Move a generation ahead. They're taught that this exists, but at the same time, society is moving forward, changing the laws, forcing people to integrate, forcing people to drop this bigotry, and then imposing laws that say if you become discriminatory or are a bigot, you will face penalty, if not criminal charges. And then you get to my generation, Gen X, and we grow up where the grandparents lived through the experiences of Jim Crow and that nonsense. Our parents probably were in the civil rights movement. And then there's us, who grow up in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. And what happens at this point is this experience is transmitted down to the kids of our level. So I'm 40 now. This transmission of racism, essentially, is a learned behavior, and it makes it a tribal in-group and out-group. The one culture is basically taught, don't trust white people. The other cultures are saying, we did some shit, back off, you need to repent, essentially, for the sins of not your father, but your grandparents. And this is why linear time, and getting to my thesis, if you will, linear time to a social justice warrior and those active in this social justice nonsense, ignore linear time. They ignore it because it's beneficial to their arguments. They are trying to be just as heroic and just as forward-thinking as their parents, if not their grandparents. Their grandparents suffered a great injustice. And maybe their great-grandparents suffered the great injustice. Depends on the age. Because this is a generational movement. Those people transmitted their injustices down to their kids because they would assume, and rightly so, because this is a tribal, this is a very instinctive thing, they assumed that they would too be persecuted by X group because they were persecuted by X group. Doesn't necessarily happen on the level that they had it. For example, the KKK was essentially defeated. There's remnants of that group still, and they have resurfaced thanks to all this fuck white people are evil, white people should be dead, all this stuff on Twitter that never gets deleted. And everything that's taught in social justice, freaking diversity, gender studies degrees of this great injustice that no longer exists legally, if not generationally. Because at the generation of 40 and younger, they will never experience, and I do mean this, they will never experience the bigotry that their forebears did. It won't happen. And the reason why it won't happen is because generational shift will occur. Your grandparents will one day die. Their experiences will be gone. Those experiences may be told to their kids and so on and so forth. Some will not transmit that and want people to be a better person. Those are usually the better people. But this is backed up by science. This is the great part of it. This cross-generational endurance, suffrage, in-group thinking, assuming that their group is always going to suffer and that things are systemic, as they put it, really is a generational perception of oh, look at that. It's time to wake up. Yeah, that was my alarm. My apologies. It's a generational perception that's transmitted down to your kids and your grandkids. So, I'm going to bring this up for you to read. Essentially, that for the sake of the eternal group, and the group is racial at this point, so keep that in mind, perceiving the group as transgenerational and endurance of in-group suffering. What this means, if you read the abstract, introduce the distinction of perceiving the in-group as an intragenerational, including only present generation of group members, so my generation, and transgenerational, including all past, present, and future generations. So they took about 1,200 people, and they focused on Jews, Palestine, American, and Swedish. I don't know why Sweden's in there. That just is weird. The tendency to perceive the group as transgeneration related to the willingness to endure in-group suffering, and that his relationship is mediated by the degree to which the group of, or the interest of the group as a whole is given primacy over the interest of the group as a collective group members. Wow, that is interesting to read. That's academic studies for you. But basically what this is saying is family units come first. That is the first in-group. If that in-group is a part of a subcultural group, so Jews for this example and Palestinians for the other example, what will happen is the slights and bigotry of the past will transmit to the present through perceived knowledge, despite changes that have been enacted by the same very generation to prevent said slights and injustices. So, taking the American example is the one that everybody harps on. There was segregation. That was the grandparents, if not great-grandparents, that either enacted that retardation or they lived through that retardation. The grandparents. Because they lived through that era, they transmit the experiences to their kids. So my generation's parents. My generation's parents would then, as a collective group of race, they would then perceive that anything that they happen to experience is probably a result of the past. And therefore, it is oppressive. It is subjective. It is racism. It's slavery, whatever the fuck you want to call it. It's actually not racism. It's discrimination. There is a distinction. No one's saying one's better or worse than the other. They're just treating people unfairly, which is not racism. It's bigotry and or discrimination. Racism has a very distinctive thing. And no, it's not power privilege. That's nonsense, because that way anybody in power and having the privilege to exercise said power is a fucking racist at that point. So, Don Lemon, you're a racist. You have a lot of institutional power. You have a really massive microphone. And when you say you have to do something about these white people, that's a transmission of the bigotry your parents and grandparents experienced. And now you're trying to take it out on us. Way to go. You just made your own power dynamic of racial privilege. See how that racism, privilege plus power doesn't work? Especially when you obtain power. Anyways. People differ in the way they perceive groups in which they belong. Yes, that's true. So if you put it in generational groups, that's what happens. Although people generally have a sense of allegiance toward their in-group, the sense of allegiance may have a different meaning depending on how the group is perceived. In the present research, we introduced the distinction between perceiving the groups intragenerational and transgenerational. We suggest that in thinking that about their in-group, some of the members focus on the present generation, whereas others include past, present, and future generations of the group. Perceiving the group as intragenerational implies focus mainly on the current cohort of group members, whereas perceiving it as TG, or transgeneration, implies thinking of the group as they extend beyond the current generation, stretching across past, present, and future generations. We reason that this distinction in the perception of one's in-group has important consequences for the group process. This is my point. And they are absolutely correct. As if you go to the bottom of their study, or you scroll all the way to the bottom. Oh, look at that. They talk about offending. Yay! General discussion. No. It'd be results. Mean standard deviation correlation coefficients. The scale found that in Table 6, as expected, the perceived group as transgenerational was significantly correlated to point int and to the endurance and suffering of an in-group hostage. What this means is the transgenerational group, the group that thinks of past, present, and future generations as one big, massive group, thinks that the suffering and endurance of that suffering is a part of their problem. So when you have the problem of racism and everyone drops linear time as if it doesn't exist, that's because they perceive their group as their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, and so on and so forth. They're transgenerational thinking. They don't think in present moment. They think about past. They think about very far past, bringing me back to my original point that some people don't know how to bury the past. These are those people. So anytime that somebody drops linear time, the best thing you can argue about that is, I don't give a shit about your past. I don't give a shit about where you came from. I care about the now. And they will hate that because that destroys their argument. They can no longer leverage the sins of the past upon the sins of the present. Laws have changed. Perceptions have changed. There's still discrimination. There's still racism. Let's target those locations and fix that, rather than worrying about things you cannot change, which is the past and the future. The last thing I want to do is, as predicted, the indirect effect of the TG on endurance and suffering of an in-group hostage through point N was significant. So, yes, it's well significant. These statistical numbers might not mean anything to you, but that mean score is pretty damn fucking high. This is the standard deviation. Yeah, that's significant. So what that means, if I'll link this in the description if anybody wants to see it. Essentially, backed up by science no less, those that think their group is transgenerational will drop linear time out the fucking window because their group that they perceive is a racial group. That racial group has no linear time. They take past, present, and potential future slights, mix them together, and say, fuck you. None of them care to live in the present. Many people, and this actually happens across all groups. So the white generation, as an example, were basically browbeaten into the effect of stop being a racist, you piece of shit. The effect is that we no longer care about race. White in general do not care what race you are. And that generational transmission is because we did once upon a time care about race. And look where that got us. Racial purity, eugenics, segregation, apartheid, just really bad, horrible policies, just shit, basically. So racial pride and racial purity are bad things to do. Our generation has learned from that and don't do it. However, those that have been slighted don't forget that, and then they apply it to the present day. So it passes down generationally as knowledge, and that's why we have social justice warriors, essentially. They're living in the past, trying to apply it to the present. I hope you enjoyed this video. I thought I'd give you a little perception of what the hell I'm talking about, and why people drop linear time out the window and just basically shit all over everybody because sins of the father are now your sins, essentially. So they'll point to anybody that's living in the millennials in particular, because their great-great-grandparents were probably a part of segregation at some point. Maybe they marched for it or against it. Their grandparents may or may not have been racists and may or may not have been a part of the KKK. That's why you see certain Congress and mayors and governors of certain states that want to have third-term, I am dilated abortions. That's why you can find them in blackface and or KKK hoods in their yearbooks in the 70s, because they were kids, they were stupid, and their parents thought that shit was cool. So they, in turn, learned that it was cool. But you notice the ones that are of that generation were like, oh, that wasn't very cool. All these people really hated it. Maybe I should stop doing that. And then they adapted. But those also are transgenerational groups, because they're like, my parents were stupid, I won't do that. And that's how you learn from your past or historical mistakes. Anyways, this is running long. I just want to bring that out a little bit, point it out, and maybe somebody can get something from it. It's basically why they drop linear time right out the window. There's a couple arguments I can think of for that. Like, you're not your grandparents. Those laws it's illegal now to do, and for good reason. How about you stop doing it too? You don't live through your grandparents' experience. Don't try to tell me that your experience is similar to their experience. What you're trying to do is leverage the experience of your group against other people. It doesn't work that way. Chances are people haven't been as bigoted as you probably think. I bet anything that the majority have not. And you found one or two assholes to point out and say, see, your group is still like that. Well, we could do the same thing if we really want to continue down that path. So, thanks for watching.
I've completed my work. Time for me to go.